I was at the park the other day.
Yeah.
And this little boy, he was maybe 5 years old, took just a nasty fall off the slide, a real thwack.
Oh, you can hear that sound.
You can. And he immediately ran to his dad, wailing, holding out this badly scraped elbow.
Mm-hmm.
So the dad, he kneels down, looks at the scrape, and then he looks right at his son.
Mm-hmm.
He says, "What are you crying for? You're fine. Suck it up. Boys don't cry."
Wow.
And the most interesting thing happened. The kid just stopped. It wasn't gradual. It was like a switch was flipped. He just sucked the sob back into his chest, wiped his face, and his expression went completely blank.
He just shut it down.
Completely. He just turned and walked away.
Yeah.
And that moment, that instantaneous shift from open emotion to this kind of hollow stoicism, it really stuck with me.
I bet.
Because at the exact same time, we're seeing men like Timothy Chalamet or Harry Styles being celebrated for their vulnerability, for being emotionally open. So these kids, they're getting two completely opposite messages, sometimes on the same day.
Yeah.
Suck it up, and also, it's okay to feel. And it's creating this profound emotional whiplash.
It really is.
And that whiplash is our mission for this deep dive. We're going to look at the clash between that traditional sturdy oak ideal, the idea that men can't show weakness, and the modern call for emotional literacy. We need to trace where these habits start, how that restriction can fuel some really dangerous ideological movements later on, and then finally look at the evidence, what actually works to support healthier masculinities.
That scene at the park is, it's a perfect snapshot of gender socialization. The cultural blueprint is just so clear. Boys should be strong, calm, maybe show anger.
Right. Anger is the acceptable one.
It is. While girls are allowed this whole spectrum of emotions like sadness and cheeriness, the message that father gave his son, it wasn't really personal. It was cultural. He was just reinforcing this idea that vulnerability equals weakness.
And that's the conventional wisdom we've all sort of been swimming in for generations. But when researchers actually measure emotional expression in thousands of kids, is that difference actually there? Is it hardwired or is it purely learned?
The science on this is fascinating. There was a massive meta-analysis. It involved over 21,000 children.
Wow.
And it found that the overall gender differences in emotional expression are surprisingly small. They're there, but it's not this huge innate gulf we assume it is.
Okay, so the differences aren't fixed. Where do they start to show up then?
Right.
And what makes them get bigger?
Well, it's mainly about two things: the type of emotion and the social context. Researchers tend to categorize emotions into two buckets. You have your externalizing emotions.
Which means pushing feelings out, like anger or frustration.
Exactly, pushing it out. And then you have internalizing emotions, which are feelings that turn inward. So sadness, anxiety, sympathy.
Okay, so my guess would be that boys lean toward the externalizing category, even if the overall difference is small.
And you'd be right. They do, but only slightly. Boys show a modest tendency to express emotions like anger more than girls do. But here's the really critical finding, the part that tells you this is a social performance.
Right.
That difference almost completely disappears when a boy is with his parents.
Wait, so when they're around mom or dad, they're not acting out more. They're regulating their frustration just fine. They know the rules.
Exactly. It's a regulated environment. But the science shows this dramatic jump in those same externalizing emotions when they're with their peers.
With other kids. Makes sense.
And this is the part that's genuinely surprising. Also, when they're completely alone.
That is baffling. Why would a boy express more frustration and anger when there's literally no audience?
Well, it's just a couple of things. First, the peer context is where the performance of masculinity is policed the most strictly. You have to be tough for the other guys. But second, if they're also expressing more anger when they're alone, it might mean that anger has become the only acceptable outlet they've internalized for, managing any kind of discomfort. It's the default emotion that's left after they've suppressed everything else.
So what did they suppress? What were the internalizing emotions that showed the biggest difference on the other side?
Girls showed slightly more positive emotions and internalizing emotions overall. But when the researchers drilled down into specific feelings, the expression of shame had the largest gender difference of all the emotions they studied. Girls were far more likely to express it than boys were.
So if you connect those two big findings, boys express anger, even alone, and they suppress shame, it suggests that really early on, the psychological move is to immediately convert any feeling of vulnerability into an acceptable external one. And that's anger. That's the restriction starting right there.
That is precisely the core developmental shift. And this pressure, it's not a one-time thing. The data shows the differences get more and more pronounced as kids move into middle childhood and then into adolescence. The culture is just constantly reinforcing it.
So we have millions of young men being structurally conditioned to feel that anger is their only legitimate emotional outlet while they push down feelings of vulnerability, anxiety, and shame. When they hit adulthood and face real struggles, where does all of that go?
This emotional restriction, when you combine it with real structural frustration, is now feeding a very serious, very visible ideological backlash. We're seeing it in the growing appeal of authoritarian and reactionary ideologies, particularly among young European men.
And what are the root causes pushing them into these corners?
It's really two key factors. The first one is structural economic decline. For a lot of young men, especially those without university degrees, that traditional role of being the main provider,
The breadwinner.
that stable masculine identity, it's just becoming unattainable. And when the economic foundation of manhood erodes, you're guaranteed to get frustration. The second factor is a direct cultural backlash against feminism and progressive gender norms.
So they feel a loss of status, and these reactionary movements step in to kind of exploit that pain with a nostalgic, simple, and often pretty aggressive story.
That's exactly it. These movements frame gender equality as a direct threat. They talk about it as a zero-sum game. Any gain for women has to be a loss for men. In that worldview, equality isn't fairness. It's a war on men.
Which provides a very simple enemy feminism for what are actually incredibly complex economic and personal frustrations.
Absolutely. The whole goal of these ideologies is to defend what researchers call hegemonic masculinity.
And that's the dominant kind of aspirational ideal of manhood, defined by hierarchy, control, power.
Total dominance. And when men feel that status is threatened, they get drawn to movements that promise to restore that hierarchy. The concepts most associated with this are, well, violence, oppression, and aggressive behavior.
And this ideology has found its main recruiting ground online, in what we now call the manosphere.
Correct. The manosphere is this whole collection of anti-feminist, often misogynistic sites. You have your incels, your MRAs, your PUAs, and they're all united by this resentment. Their central philosophy is called taking the red pill.
Right, which means believing you've woken up to the truth that society is oppressed by feminism and that women are inherently manipulative.
Yes. And the emotional pull of that belief system is immense. It transforms personal failure or frustration, which would otherwise feel like that shame from childhood, into political anger. So instead of feeling, I failed, the ideology tells you, the system failed me, society oppressed me. It gives you a clean psychological out.
And that transformation from shame to external anger and ideological victimhood, that's why this online radicalization has been directly linked to real-world violence.
Okay.
The suppression of vulnerability in childhood is manifesting as violence in adulthood.
So if we connect this to the bigger picture, addressing these trends needs a huge two-pronged strategy. You have to address the material roots of their discontent. So economic reform, making sure young men have a path to success. But crucially, you also have to transform the narrative around masculinity itself. And that requires targeted, evidence-based interventions.
So what does that transformation actually look like? If the core problem is that men are taught to default to anger and dominance, how do you even begin to teach empathy and vulnerability instead?
The interventions that work, they focus on three key areas. 1, reducing violence. 2, actively reframing masculinity toward cooperative, caring models. And 3, training bystanders to interrupt harmful behavior.
But the way you deliver that message has to be just as important as the message itself.
Oh, absolutely. Because if you walk into a room and start lecturing about toxic masculinity, you probably lost them before you've even started.
Built-in resistance.
Total resistance. The research shows programs are most successful when they're led by trusted facilitators and peer leaders and in familiar, non-clinical settings.
Like that shape-up intervention I read about.
Exactly. Using barbers as facilitators in barbershops, they're community figures, they already have trust, and the environment is contextually relevant. It's not therapy, it's a conversation.
That makes perfect sense. You're
Yeah.
leveraging existing social structures. But what about the message itself? What does it have to focus on to actually work?
It has to challenge that core idea of dominance, hegemonic masculinity directly. Interventions that only focus on surface-level stuff like, reducing alcohol use, they fail if they don't tackle the underlying belief that violence and control are essential to being a man.
And since the problem is rooted in deep emotional suppression, you can't just solve it with a lecture. It has to be experiential.
Absolutely not. The most effective formats are group-based, offering safe spaces for real emotional reflection and peer accountability. And they rely heavily on things like role-playing, sociodrama, participatory storytelling.
Things that bypass the intellectual defenses and force emotional engagement.
Precisely. They promote the self-awareness and vulnerability that got shut down in childhood.
And are there specific relationships where these efforts have the most impact?
Yes. Programs focused on family and relationships show really powerful results. We've seen trials that engage fathers, for example, and they've significantly increased gender equitable attitudes, the time fathers spend on chores, even maternal decision-making power. Promoting positive, involved fatherhood is a fantastic entry point.
This all sounds promising, but cultural change is incredibly slow. Once these interventions end, do the positive changes actually stick around?
That is the greatest challenge. It's the focus of so much research right now. While the short-term results are often very encouraging, you see better communication. Less psychological aggression studies often show those gains can diminish significantly after just 12 months.
Only a year.
It just highlights the critical need for sustained, intensive engagement. You are battling decades of cultural messaging. A few weeks isn't enough to permanently rewire behavioral norms.
So what we've seen today is this clear, direct line. It connects that moment in the park, the father telling his son to suck it up, all the way to the rise of dangerous ideologies online. The cultural conditioning demands that boys reject vulnerability.
And that rejection creates a reservoir of frustration that is so easily weaponized by misogynistic narratives when they become adults.
And the research confirms that changing a man's relationship with dominance and anger is not a quick fix. It requires, on one hand, addressing the lack of economic opportunity for young men.
And on the other, implementing sustained, peer-led, emotionally demanding interventions that work over years, not months, to transform that entire cultural context. The cost of that early emotional repression isn't just measured in individual misery, but in real societal instability.